Clara Jennings thought becoming a maid for the wealthy Harrow family would be a blessing, a chance to escape her debts and start fresh. But the moment she stepped into the mansion, she sensed something was wrong. The walls whispered when no one spoke. Mirrors reflected things that weren't there. And at night she swore she heard another maid sweeping the halls, though Clara was the only servant hired. By the time she discovered the uniforms left behind by those who came before her, it was already too late. Because the house wasn't just keeping memories, it was keeping the maids themselves. The day I arrived at the mansion, the sky was gray, heavy with clouds, and the air carried that sharp chill that seeps into the bones. I carried only one suitcase with me, containing the essentials: plain clothes, a couple of notebooks, and the new maid's uniform I had been told to wear. The mansion towered above me, its windows dark and lifeless like watching eyes, its stone walls streaked with years of rain and neglect. For a moment, I almost turned back, but I couldn't. Work was scarce, and I needed the money more than anything. The owner wasn't there to greet me. A sealed envelope had been left at the entrance, addressed with my name in thick, black ink. I tore it open with trembling fingers. The message was short, only a few lines, written in the same neat hand. Clean the upper floors during the day. The kitchen is stocked. Stay in the attic room. Avoid the basement. There was no signature, no welcome, no explanation, just orders. I stepped inside, and the first thing that hit me was the smell. It was faint, but it clung to everything, a mixture of damp wood, dust, and something else, something faintly sweet, almost like rotting fruit. The hallway stretched before me, lined with old portraits whose faces seemed to vanish into the shadows. Every step I took echoed, bouncing against the high ceilings. It felt less like entering a home and more like stepping into a mausoleum. I forced myself to start working. The first hours were filled with dusting, sweeping, wiping down shelves so old they left gray streaks across the cloth. The silence was suffocating. No sound of traffic, no voices, only the occasional groan of the wooden beams above me. By the time evening fell, I was exhausted, and the vastness of the mansion made me feel like an ant crawling through the body of some ancient, sleeping beast. When I climbed the stairs to the attic, I felt the shift immediately. The air grew colder, and the steps seemed to drag beneath my weight. My attic room was small, with a single narrow bed and a wooden dresser pushed against the wall. The lone window overlooked the grounds, but the glass was cloudy, blurring the world outside. I placed my suitcase by the bed, changed into my nightgown, and told myself I would grow used to the strangeness in time. But that first night, the noises began. At first it was faint, like a broom sweeping slowly against the floorboards. I sat upright, straining my ears. The sound grew louder, more deliberate, dragging across the hallway outside my room. My own broom was locked in the supply closet downstairs. I knew it wasn't me, but the steady sweep made my skin crawl. I crept closer to the door, pressing my ear against the wood. The sweeping stopped at once, replaced by a silence so deep I could hear the frantic pounding of my own heart. I stayed frozen for minutes, waiting for some explanation, another sound, a breeze, even footsteps. Nothing came. Finally, with my breath caught in my throat, I turned back toward the bed. That's when I noticed the floor. At first I thought it was just the shadow of the moonlight sneaking in through the window, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was something else. From the narrow gap beneath the door, something thin and dark had begun to seep through. Long strands of wet black hair were curling slowly across the floorboards, inching their way toward my feet. They glistened in the pale light, each strand thick with moisture, twisting and reaching like fingers trying to touch me. I staggered back, my legs hitting the bed frame, my throat tightening with terror. The strands moved with purpose, slithering across the wood, spreading wider, their ends brushing against my bare toes. The touch was cold, clammy, and real. I couldn't scream, couldn't even breathe. My body shook as I pressed myself against the wall, every nerve screaming for me to run, yet my limbs refused to obey. The hair stopped moving, lying flat against the floor as if it had never been alive at all, but I knew it had. I had felt it, smelled its faint, sickly dampness. I stayed awake the rest of the night, shivering in silence, watching the dark strands until the first light of dawn slipped into the room. And just like that, they were gone, leaving only the bare wooden floor behind, as though nothing had happened at all. But something had happened. Something was waiting for me in that house. And I had already broken the most important rule of survival. I had let it know I was afraid. I woke with a heavy feeling in my chest, the kind of exhaustion that clings no matter how long you lie still. The daylight should have comforted me, but the memory of the black strands of hair still burned in my mind. When I looked down at the floor, it was clean, no sign of what I had seen. The boards were dry, pale with age, and untouched. I told myself that fear must have twisted my senses, that I was overtired from the long journey and my first day of work. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, the faint sensation of cold, damp hair brushing my toes still lingered. I forced myself into the routine of cleaning. The house was endless, room after room layered with dust. Some doors opened easily, others resisted like they hadn't been touched in years. I polished the banisters, scrubbed the tiled floors, and dusted the cabinets, trying to drown my thoughts in the rhythm of work. Still, I couldn't ignore the feeling that the house was watching me. It was as though my every movement was being observed from the corners, from the shadows behind the furniture, from the darkened glass of mirrors I tried not to look into. By midday, I entered a bedroom I had avoided the day before. It was larger than the others, with a wide canopy bed draped in heavy curtains that smelled faintly of mildew. The window was covered in grime, dimming the light. As I began to tidy, I froze. On the perfectly made bed lay a maid's uniform, neatly folded, identical to the one I wore. The sight made my stomach clench. I hadn't put it there, and no one else lived here. The fabric was crisp and fresh, but the collar caught my attention. It was stained, blotched with dark, dried marks that looked disturbingly like blood. I stared at it too long, my breathing uneven, waiting for it to vanish the way the hair had. But it didn't. It remained as solid and undeniable as the floor beneath me. My instinct was to throw it away, to burn it, but I was too afraid of doing anything that might awaken something worse. Instead, I shoved it into the bottom drawer of the dresser, slamming it shut as if that would erase it. I told myself again that I was imagining things, but my hands wouldn't stop trembling. The rest of the day I couldn't concentrate. Every time I bent to sweep or reached at dust, I felt as though eyes were boring into my back. My skin prickled with goosebumps in the still air, and I jumped at the smallest sounds, the creak of a board, the sigh of the wind slipping through cracked windows. By the time I retreated to my attic room, the weight of dread had settled so heavily on me that I could hardly swallow food. When night came, I locked the door, though I doubted it would stop anything. I lay stiff in bed, staring at the ceiling beams, the room silent except for my shallow breathing. At first I thought exhaustion might win, but then I felt it. A soft tug at the edge of my blanket. My body froze, my heart hammering. The blanket slipped slowly, inch by inch, pulled by something I couldn't see. I clutched the mattress, willing myself to stay still. The blanket slid past my waist, then my knees. My skin prickled with cold air. Every instinct screamed to grab it back, to fight, but fear pinned me down like invisible chains. Out of the corner of my eye, in the darkest corner of the room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The uniform I had hidden away was there, upright, standing as if someone wore it, though no body filled the sleeves or the skirt. It leaned slightly forward, the collar dark and dripping. A thick, black liquid slid down from the neckline, splattering onto the floor with soft, wet sounds. The droplets spread across the wood, reaching toward the bed. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. The room spun with terror as the blanket was pulled completely off, leaving me exposed to the cold air. The uniform didn't move closer, but its presence filled every corner, suffocating me. The dripping sound grew louder, steady and endless, until I thought it might never stop. When the candlelight flickered and went out, I was swallowed by darkness, left with nothing but the sound of liquid hitting the floor and the sickening certainty that I was no longer alone. I stopped counting the days after that second night. Time inside the mansion stretched in strange ways, like the house itself was bending it. I worked because I had to, but every task felt heavier, as if the air itself was pressing against me. My arms grew sore from scrubbing, but I was too afraid to stop for long. If I sat in silence, I would start to hear things again: the faint sweep of a broom, the slow drip of unseen liquid, the whisper of hair brushing against the floor. I avoided mirrors for as long as I could, but the house was full of them. Long, tall mirrors framed in ornate gold lined the hallways, and smaller ones sat on the dresses of bedrooms. Dust blurred many of them, but even in their haze I felt the same dreadful pull. On one afternoon, I forced myself to clean one, just to keep up with my duties. I wiped the glass with slow strokes, trying not to look directly at it, but my gaze slipped. My reflection stared back, pale and trembling, just as I expected. Yet something was wrong. When I lifted my arm to continue wiping, the reflection did not move. I froze, rag pressed against the glass, my breath shallow. My own image remained still, eyes locked on me with an expression that didn't belong to me, cold, empty, waiting. A chill spread through my body, and I backed away, leaving the rag to fall to the floor. For a few seconds, the reflection continued to watch me, its lips twitching faintly as if it wanted to form a smile. Then, in a blink, it mimicked my movement again, perfectly normal, as though nothing had happened. From that moment, I stopped cleaning mirrors. I avoided their gaze, lowering my eyes whenever I passed. Still, I could feel them. Even without looking, I knew they were watching, every reflection waiting for the moment I might slip. Nights were worse. My attic room no longer felt like a place of rest but a cage. I would lie still, blankets pulled tightly around me, listening to the faint creaks of the floor outside my door. Some nights the sound circled my room, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing endlessly. I tried not to move, not to breathe too loud, fearing that any sign of life would draw it closer. One night I decided I had to know. I pushed myself from the bed and lowered to the floor, pressing my cheek against the wood. Through the thin gap beneath the door, I peered into the hallway. At first, all I saw was darkness. Then, my eyes adjusted and I realized I was not alone. Lying flat against the boards was another maid's uniform. It was arranged carefully, sleeves spread, skirt smoothed, as if someone invisible was wearing it. Though I couldn't see a face, I felt its attention locked on me, staring back through the tiny crack of light. My breath hitched, and I scrambled back, knocking into the dresser. When I dared to look again, the hallway was empty. I told myself I wouldn't look again, but something inside me knew it wasn't gone. It was waiting for the right time. That night, I barely closed my eyes, too afraid of what I might find when I opened them again. It was just before dawn when I heard the scratching, faint at first, like nails dragging across the wood. My eyes darted to the far wall. The sound grew louder, deeper, as though something unseen was carving into the plaster itself. I gripped the blanket, frozen in terror, as letters began to form. At first the grooves were shallow, jagged, but soon they sharpened into clear shapes. S-T-A-Y. The word carved itself slowly, painfully, with each stroke sounding like bones grating against stone. By the time it was finished, my chest was heaving, my body drenched in cold sweat. I wanted to run, but where could I go? The front door had already refused me once. I knew then that the house was not letting me go anywhere. When the sun finally rose, its light spilling weakly through the cloudy glass of the attic window, the word remained on the wall, carved deep, as real as my own breath. No matter how much I scrubbed, no matter how hard I pressed the rag into the grooves, the word would not fade. It was etched there forever, a command I could not disobey. And as I clinged, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was smiling. The days became unbearable after the message carved itself into the wall. Every step I took inside the mansion filled me with dread, but I kept moving, kept cleaning, because the silence became worse if I stopped. My thoughts spun endlessly, asking questions I didn't want to answer. Who left the uniform on the bed? Who swept the floor outside my room? Who or what wanted me to stay? The house never gave answers. It only offered signs, warnings, and small pieces of something much larger than I could understand. I began to notice that doors shifted. A room I had already cleaned one day might not look the same the next. Furniture would be angled differently, curtains drawn in places I never touched. Items moved slightly as if a careful hand had been rearranging them when I wasn't watching. It gave me the horrible sense that someone else lived in the house with me, someone who stayed just out of sight, waiting for me to discover the changes. The front door no longer tempted me. I had tried it only once more after the word appeared, and the handle burned icy cold against my palm. The lock refused to budge, though I had the key. It was not stuck, not jammed. It was sealed, as though the house itself had made a decision. My escape was no longer possible, and that realization pressed down on me harder than anything else. My fear grew sharper one afternoon when I stumbled upon a locked door on the second floor. I had passed it many times before but never dared to try it. That day desperation gnawed at me, and I twisted the knob with more force than usual. To my surprise, it gave way, creaking open into darkness. The smell that drifted out was stronger than anything else in the mansion: damp cloth, mildew, and something faintly metallic, like rust or blood. I stepped inside and froze. The room stretched longer than I expected, walls lined with shapes that at first seemed harmless. Rows of mannequins stood shoulder to shoulder, each one dressed in the same maid's uniform I wore. Their hands hung lifelessly at their sides, their heads tilted at strange angles. Covering each face was a porcelain mask, cracked in places, painted with faded features, dark eyebrows, red lips, hollow eyes. They were arranged carefully, like soldiers waiting for orders. The air thickened in my lungs as I tried to convince myself they were just mannequins, just objects someone had stored here. But the way their heads tilted, the way their arms hung stiffly at their sides, made them feel alive in a way mannequins should never feel. My feet moved backward before I even realized, heart pounding so hard I thought the sound might echo. That was when one of them twitched. The motion was small, just a subtle shiver through its shoulders, but it was enough to make my stomach drop. I stared, frozen, as the porcelain mask on its face shifted slightly, scraping against the skin beneath. Because there was skin beneath, gray, tight, sickly, with hollow cheeks and lips that peeled into a smile that didn't belong to the living. My breath caught. I wanted to run, but my legs felt heavy, stuck to the floor. Then another mask cracked, splintering down the middle. A pale hand lifted, trembling unnaturally, and pushed the broken pieces away to reveal another rotting face beneath. One by one, across the row, the mannequins began to stir. Masks slipped, cracked, and fell, each revealing the decaying features of women with sunken eyes and half-open mouths. Some still wore fragments of porcelain clinging to their skin. Others blinked with milky eyes that rolled toward me. A sound filled the room, then soft at first, like porcelain breaking against stone. But soon it grew louder, a chorus of brittle cracks and creaks as the mannequins turned their heads together, every single one facing me. Their eyes locked onto mine, hollow and endless. The weight of their gaze broke whatever spell had pinned me. I stumbled backward, colliding with the doorframe, fumbling for the handle with shaking hands. I pulled with all my strength, slamming the door shut. Just as the sound of shuffling feet scraped against the floor inside, I pressed my back against the wood, chest heaving, trying to steady my breath, but it was useless. The sound of movement continued on the other side, slow, uneven steps, dragging across the boards, accompanied by the faint rattle of porcelain fragments dropping to the ground. When the noise finally stopped, I dared to open my eyes. My vision swam with tears, my hand still clutching the knob. The silence in the hallway felt wrong. Too still, too watchful, and though I never opened that door again, I knew they were still there, standing in the dark, waiting for me to make another mistake. That night, as I lay in bed with the blanket wrapped tightly around me, I heard the faint sound of porcelain tapping gently against the walls of the house, traveling slowly upward, closer to the attic. I do not remember how I ended up in the basement. My memory of that night feels broken, like shattered glass, but I know I didn't go down there willingly. One moment I was lying awake in the attic, clutching the blanket as the faint tapping of porcelain echoed through the walls, and the next I was standing at the top of the basement stairs, staring into a darkness so deep my eyes refused to adjust. My hand was already clutching a candle, its weak flame trembling as though it feared the blackness it had been forced to enter. The air was different down there, heavier, wet, and foul with the stench of mold and rust. Each step I took sent the stairs groaning, as if warning me to turn back. I wanted to, but my body moved as though pulled by invisible hands. The flame swayed, casting shadows that seemed to breathe along the walls. The deeper I went, the colder it became, until my breath appeared in thin clouds. At the bottom of the stairs, the floor stretched out into a wide chamber I hadn't known existed. Wooden crates lined the walls in perfect rows, stacked on one another like coffins. The candlelight barely reached the far corners, but what I saw was enough to stop me cold. Carved into each lid was a name. They weren't random, each was written with deliberate strokes, as though someone had taken great care to mark every single one. I stepped closer, my candle shaking in my grip. Dust covered most of the crates, but the first name I wiped clean made my blood run cold. It was familiar, too familiar. I had seen it before on one of the portraits in the hallway upstairs. I moved down the row, brushing away dust, reading name after name, all women, all names I recognized from scraps of letters I had found, photographs tucked into forgotten drawers, uniforms folded in neat piles. My skin prickled as I reached the crate nearest the center. The dust here was thin, the wood newer, the carving sharper. It was my own name. I staggered back, the candle nearly slipping from my hand. My name etched deep into the wood, so deep that the groove seemed fresh, the shavings still clinging to the edges. My throat closed, and the sound that escaped me was closer to a whimper than a breath. I didn't want to know what lay inside, but the crate seemed to open by itself, the lid creaking back slowly, groaning as though it had been waiting. Inside was a maid's uniform, folded with painful precision. The collar was soaked, dripping a thick black liquid that spilled over the edges and pooled onto the stone floor. The smell of rot rose up, choking, unbearable. I covered my mouth but could not move away. My legs locked as if the floor itself had frozen me there. The sound came then, a shuffling from behind. I turned, raising the candle, and my heart stopped. They were standing at the bottom of the stairs. The mannequins from the upstairs room, but not mannequins anymore. Their porcelain masks had shattered completely, leaving only the rotting gray faces of the women beneath. Eyes clouded with death rolled toward me, jaws slack, some with teeth broken, others with lips torn away. Their maid uniforms hung from their bodies in tatters, stiff with stains that I did not want to identify. They moved together, dragging their feet across the stone, the sound of their approach blending with the steady dripping from the crate. The candle flickered, throwing shadows that made their movements jagged and twitching, but they never stopped. They raised their hands in unison, long fingers stretched out, all pointing directly at the crate with my name carved into it. I shook my head, backing away, but there was nowhere to go. The wall pressed into my back, cold and damp, leaving me trapped. My grip on the candle faltered, the wax burning my skin as I held it too tightly. The figures shuffled closer, filling the chamber, their eyes never breaking from me. The flame sputtered once, then died, plunging me into blackness. In that suffocating dark, their footsteps grew louder, closer. I felt them surround me, the air thick with their stench. Cold fingers brushed against my arms, gripping tighter, pulling me downward. My knees hit the stone floor, and I felt the edge of the open crate against my body. The liquid inside soaked my gown, cold and sticky, seeping into my skin. Then came the whisper, right against my ear, soft but unmistakable, in a voice that was not mine and yet sounded exactly like me. The same pitch, the same tone, the same rhythm of breath. It spoke only one word, stretching it out as though savoring it. Stay. The darkness swallowed me whole, and I knew then the house had never wanted a maid. It wanted something else entirely.